The city was alive with the hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional screech of tires as cars darted through the streets. But within the small apartment on the 5th floor, there was a silence that contrasted sharply with the world outside. Detective Emily Carter sat at the small wooden dining table, her fork moving slowly over the half-eaten salad in front of her. The apartment was sparsely decorated, with only the bare essentials: a couch, a coffee table, a few frames hanging on the walls, each one capturing moments from a life that seemed far removed from the present. She wasn't hungry. She hadn't been hungry for a while. Her job consumed her, filling her every waking moment with the weight of responsibility. The files on the desk in the corner of the room, the ones she had promised herself she would get through tonight, remained untouched. The pile seemed to grow larger with each passing day. But Emily wasn't just a detective. She was a woman trapped in a life she had never truly chosen, one where she had to prove herself over and over again. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the silence. She glanced at the screen. Detective Mark Jacobs. "Yeah," she answered, trying to sound unaffected. "We've got a lead," Mark said, his voice sharp with urgency. "It's about the Ramirez case." Emily's heart quickened. She pushed the uneaten salad aside and grabbed her jacket, slipping it on. The weight of the case had been hanging over her for weeks, and now, finally, there was a glimmer of hope. "I'll be there in 10, she said, hanging up without another word. She didn't have to tell him to stay sharp. They both knew the stakes. The Ramirez case was one of the most dangerous she had encountered in her career, an underground drug operation run by the notorious gang leader, Javier Ramirez, a man with no conscience, no hesitation, a man who would do anything to maintain control over his empire. Emily had been tracking him for months, but so far, he had evaded capture. The city was darkening by the time Emily reached the precinct, the familiar glow of the streetlights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. Inside, the precinct buzzed with activity, officers moving briskly between desks, phones ringing incessantly. Mark was waiting for her by the coffee machine, a cup in his hand. His expression was tense, his eyes darting between the various papers spread out before him. He looked up as Emily approached, his gaze flicking to the empty cup in her hand. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. "Always," Emily replied, her tone steady. She took a deep breath, shaking off the remnants of fatigue that clung to her. This was what she was here for. This was her purpose. Mark handed her a file, his finger pointing to a photograph of a man in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive suit. Javier Ramirez. Emily's eyes narrowed as she scanned the file. The picture barely captured the man's true nature. His cold, calculating eyes spoke volumes about the person he was. "We finally got him," Mark said, leaning in close. "We know where he's hiding. We've got a team set to move in, but we need you to back us up." Emily nodded, her jaw tightening. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Ramirez was not a man to be taken lightly. If this was going to work, they needed precision, timing, and a lot of luck. As they headed toward the parking lot, Emily's mind began to race. She had always known the risks that came with the job, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, an almost oppressive weight that had nothing to do with the case. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. They arrived at the location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building stood in the shadows, its windows boarded up, its doors rusted shut. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. Emily's grip tightened around the handle of her gun as she joined the rest of the team, moving quietly through the darkened streets. As they neared the warehouse, Emily felt a shift in the atmosphere. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct warning her to be cautious. She exchanged a glance with Mark, who nodded in acknowledgement. They were both on edge, and for good reason. This was a man who had built his empire on fear and manipulation, a man who had destroyed lives without a second thought. They reached the warehouse's side entrance. Mark signaled for the team to stop, and Emily crouched down, her heart pounding in her chest. The plan was simple: move in, secure Ramirez, and get him out of there before anyone noticed. But the stillness of the night seemed to mock them, the silence amplifying every footstep, every breath. Suddenly, a sound pierced the air: footsteps from inside the building. Emily's body went rigid, her senses heightened. She motioned for the team to hold their position, and within moments, the door opened, revealing a man who looked as though he had stepped out of a nightmare. Javier Ramirez. He was taller than she expected, his broad shoulders and muscular frame casting an imposing shadow. His face was sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. But it wasn't just his physical presence that sent a chill down her spine. It was the aura of authority he carried, as though he knew the game better than anyone else. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Emily. For a moment, time seemed to slow down, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. "Detective Carter," Ramirez said, his voice smooth, almost taunting. "I've been expecting you." Emily's hand instinctively reached for her gun, but before she could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. Mark's voice rang out, low and urgent. "Move in." It was chaos. Shots rang out, shattering the quiet night. Emily's pulse raced as she sprinted toward Ramirez, her mind focused on one goal: capturing him. But Ramirez was ready. He was always ready. As she closed the distance, he lunged, knocking her to the ground with a force that left her breathless. Pain shot through her side as she struggled to regain control, her instincts kicking in. She reached for her gun, but Ramirez was faster. He had her pinned. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears. Her thoughts raced. This was it. This was the moment that could define everything. If she failed now, she would never get another chance. But Emily Carter wasn't the type to back down. With a surge of strength, she twisted her body, throwing Ramirez off balance just long enough to free herself. She rolled to her feet, her gun aimed directly at him. "You're done," she said, her voice low and steady. Ramirez sneered, his eyes gleaming with malice, but he didn't move. He knew he had lost. "You think you've won," he spat. "You've only just begun." As the team moved in to restrain him, Emily's mind lingered on his words. There was something in his voice, something that made her uneasy. The storm was far from over. The cold air of the early morning seeped through the walls of the precinct, settling into the bones of everyone inside. The lights were harsh and uninviting, casting long shadows over the desks piled with files and unfinished paperwork. Emily sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, yet her mind was elsewhere. The arrest of Javier Ramirez should have been a victory. It should have been a moment of relief, of satisfaction. But it wasn't. The weight of his words lingered, echoing in the back of her mind like a whisper that refused to be silenced. "You've only just begun." Mark had been the first to notice that something was off. He had been watching her from the other side of the room, his brow furrowed in concern. "Emily," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You okay?" She looked up at him, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Mark didn't buy it. He never did. About Ramirez. She nodded, her fingers gripping the edges of the file in front of her, the one that contained the damning evidence they had finally gotten their hands on after weeks of chasing shadows. The file that held the secrets of a criminal empire. "We got him. He's behind bars," she said. But even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. "Yeah, but you heard what he said. You saw the way he acted. He wasn't scared. He was too calm. He knows something we don't." Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room, though she wasn't really looking at anything in particular. She had spent years hunting down criminals like Ramirez, each victory adding a small piece to the puzzle of justice she was trying to build. But this felt different. The quiet unease gnawed at her gut, and the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like Ramirez wasn't the real threat. He was only the tip of the iceberg. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. It was an alert new intelligence. She opened the message, her heart skipping a beat as she read the contents. There had been a breach. The message was brief, but the implications were clear. Despite their best efforts, the operation had been compromised. There were other players involved, someone higher up the food chain who had been pulling the strings all along. Emily stood up sharply, her chair scraping against the floor. She didn't need to say anything for Mark to understand. He was already grabbing his jacket, moving quickly toward the door. "Let's go," she said, her voice low and resolute. "We're not done yet." The car ride to the location was silent, the tension thick between them. Emily's thoughts were swirling in a storm of confusion and dread. Who was behind Ramirez? Who had the resources, the power, to have orchestrated everything from the shadows, and why had they allowed her to catch him so easily? As they arrived at the location, a rundown warehouse at the edge of the city, Emily's instincts were on high alert. The place had been abandoned for years. Yet there was something about it now that felt different. It didn't feel abandoned anymore. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, moving as quietly as possible. The faint hum of activity could be heard from inside, a soft buzz of voices that didn't belong to the city's usual nightlife. Emily signaled for Mark to take the left side of the building, while she took the right. They crept forward, trying to remain unseen. The plan was simple: get inside, gather information, and make sure they weren't walking into a trap. But as she approached the door, the sound of a gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. Emily's heart stopped for a split second. She instinctively ducked, pressing herself against the cold wall of the building. "Mark," she hissed into her comm. No answer. She was alone. Adrenaline surged through her as she pushed forward, moving swiftly toward the source of the shot. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, her breathing steady but quick. She knew the risks, knew that being a cop in a world like this meant facing death at every turn. But something told her that tonight was different. Something told her that this wasn't just a routine bust. She reached the corner of the warehouse, peeking around it to find Mark on the ground, his body motionless, blood pooled around him, dark and crimson against the gray concrete. Mark, Emily's voice cracked with panic as she rushed to his side. He was alive. Barely. His eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain evident in his gaze. "Get up," she urged, her voice firm but strained. "We need to move." Mark groaned, trying to push himself up, but the pain was too much. He gritted his teeth, his hand reaching for his gun. "It's a setup. They knew we were coming," he managed to say, his voice weak. Emily's mind raced. This wasn't just about Ramirez. Whoever was behind this was making a statement. They were sending a message. But what message? She grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward cover as another round of gunfire rang out. The shots were getting closer, and she knew they had to move. She couldn't stay there. Not like this. "We have to get back to the precinct," Emily said, her voice low and determined. "We need to regroup and figure out who's pulling the strings. We're not leaving until we have answers." Mark nodded weakly, his breath labored. He could barely stand, but he knew better than to argue. They had no choice. Emily glanced around, her instincts screaming that they were being watched. The danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And it was only just beginning. The following days were a blur. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her was crumbling, that her every move was being watched, that the walls were closing in. She had seen Mark in the hospital, struggling to recover from his injuries, but the doctors assured her that he would be fine. His wounds weren't fatal. Yet, she couldn't shake the image of him lying there, bloodied and beaten, a reminder of how dangerous this game had become. They had tried to press forward with the investigation, but the deeper they dug, the more elusive their answers became. Javier Ramirez was no longer just the leader of a small-time drug syndicate. He was a pawn in something far larger, something that stretched across the city's criminal underworld like a spider's web. The precinct had been buzzing with rumors, whispers about the new player in town, a shadowy figure who had orchestrated the attack on Mark. No one knew who it was. All they had were cryptic messages, coded intel that led to dead ends. Emily had spent hours staring at the files, each one more frustrating than the last. She was at a crossroads, unsure of where to turn next. Her instincts told her that Ramirez was just the tip of the iceberg. But who could be behind him? Who could have the power to manipulate the entire criminal network? It wasn't until she received an unexpected call that things began to unravel. "Detective Carter!" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the tone was sharp and urgent. "You don't know me, but I have information about Ramirez, and I think you're looking in the wrong direction." Emily's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice low and steady. The person hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Meet me at the old docks, Pier 13, midnight. Come alone if you want the truth." The line went dead before she could respond. For a moment, Emily considered the risks. She was a detective, not some rookie who ran after every lead without thinking. She knew the dangers of trusting unknown sources. But something about the call gnawed at her, a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. She had been chasing shadows for weeks. Maybe this was the break she needed. The night was cold when Emily arrived at the docks. The pier was empty. The only sounds the distant crash of waves against the concrete and the occasional creak of the wooden beams above her. She kept her hand on her gun, her senses on high alert. She stepped further into the shadows, eyes scanning every corner, every movement. Nothing. Then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, thin, and wearing a long black coat. He looked almost out of place in the night. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and his voice was low, almost a whisper as he addressed her. "Detective Carter," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "You've been looking for the wrong person." Emily's fingers tightened around the handle of her gun. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing Ramirez go down." "You think you can help me?" Emily's voice was laced with skepticism, but the man's air of confidence made her pause. "I don't help people," he replied. "I help myself, but right now, our goals align. You want answers. I want the same thing. And I have information that you won't find in any of your files." Emily took a step closer, watching him closely. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing for now," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But that might change. I need you to understand that I'm not doing this for charity. So, if you want to hear what I have to say, you'll listen carefully." She nodded, giving him the signal to continue. "The man you're after," he began. "Javier Ramirez. He's a small player in a much bigger game. The real power is someone you've never even heard of. Someone who controls everything from behind the scenes. But the deeper you dig, the more danger you're in. There are people who don't want the truth to come out." Emily didn't flinch. She had heard threats before, but something in the man's voice gave her pause. There was a sense of urgency, as though he genuinely feared for her safety. "Who's behind it all?" Emily demanded. The man took a step back, his face now partially visible under the dim light. His eyes were cold, calculating, and he didn't look like someone who would make a false move. "You're looking for the wrong person," he repeated. "Forget Ramirez. The real mastermind is someone you'll never expect. He's untouchable." Emily's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. But the man's next words sent a chill through her. "His name is Victor Black." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Victor Black was a name she had only heard in passing, a shadow in the city's criminal circles. A legend whispered about but never confirmed. No one knew who he really was. No one knew how he operated. But everyone knew he was untouchable. "Victor Black," she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. "How do you know that name?" The man's smile grew darker. "I know a lot of things, detective, things you wouldn't believe. But if you want to bring down Ramirez, you'll have to go through Black. And believe me, that's not something anyone in this city has ever managed to do." Emily's mind raced. This was the lead she had been searching for. Victor Black, the man behind everything. But why was this mysterious figure helping her? And what did he stand to gain? Before she could ask another question, the man turned and began to walk away, his coat fluttering behind him like a shadow. "Wait," Emily called, but he didn't stop. "Where do I find him?" "You don't," he called back over his shoulder, his voice fading into the night. "He finds you." And just like that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Emily standing at the pier, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and realization. Victor Black was the key, but now, more than ever, she felt the weight of the danger closing in around her. The next few days were a blur of activity, as Emily threw herself deeper into the investigation, her determination to bring down Victor Black overshadowing everything else. Every lead she followed only seemed to circle back to dead ends or trails that led her to even darker corners of the city. She couldn't shake the memory of the mysterious informant, the man who had given her the most critical lead of her career, Victor Black. The name was a whisper in the underworld, a legend that no one dared speak too loudly. Everyone knew that to even mention him was to invite disaster. But Emily wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth, no matter what it took, no matter who stood in her way. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. The precinct was on edge, the atmosphere tense. Every officer seemed to be on high alert, as if they could feel the storm that was brewing. The criminal world was shifting, and it seemed that Emily was standing right in the middle of it, caught between the forces of justice and the looming shadows of corruption. She sat in her office late one night, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The piles of files, the notes, the maps, all felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had made no progress in the last 48 hours. Ramirez was in custody, but that had been the easy part. The real challenge lay in taking down Black and unraveling the web of power he controlled. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. The message was short and cryptic. "He knows you're coming. Be ready." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The message wasn't from any known contact. The unknown sender had to be connected to Black somehow. This was a warning, but to what she quickly dialed Mark's number, her fingers trembling with urgency. "Mark, I need you to check something for me," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "Someone just sent me a warning about Black. I need to know if we're being watched." "I'll get on it, but you need to be careful." "Emily," Mark replied, his voice full of concern. "This guy, Black, he's not like Ramirez. He's a ghost. We don't know what we're dealing with here." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to do this." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Mark knew she wouldn't back down. He knew her better than anyone else. And he knew that once she locked onto something, she wouldn't stop until it was finished. "I'll be careful," Emily promised, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they meant little. There was no going back now. Not for her. Not for anyone. The night air was cool and still as Emily stepped out of the precinct, her thoughts racing with what she had just learned. Victor Black knew she was coming. And if he knew that, then there was no telling how much more he knew. How long had he been watching her? What had he seen? What did he want? As she made her way to her car, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Her hand instinctively moved to her gun, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the holster. She spun around, ready for whatever confrontation lay ahead. But there was no one there. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining things. But then she heard it again, the faint shuffle of footsteps, just out of view. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved quickly to the car, slipping inside and locking the door behind her. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the street for any sign of movement. She saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched remained. The streets were empty, save for a few stray cars speeding down the road. Emily's breath came in short gasps as she tried to steady herself. She was being paranoid. It was nothing, just her nerves getting the best of her. Or was it? Suddenly, the phone rang again. It was a blocked number. "Hello," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "Detective Carter?" A smooth, unrecognizable voice replied. You've been looking for answers, but answers aren't what you want. Are they? You want to take down Black. You want revenge for your friend. Emily's pulse quickened. It was him. The voice was unmistakable. Victor Black. Who are you? She demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. What do you want from me? The voice chuckled softly, sending a chill down her spine. What I want you to understand that you're out of your depth. Detective, you've already made a dangerous enemy. And now, you've made it personal. The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her in stunned silence. The next morning, Emily arrived at the office, her mind still reeling from the phone call. She had been warned. She had been threatened. But it didn't matter. She had come too far to back out now. She couldn't. Not with everything on the line. She found Mark waiting for her, his face grim. It's worse than I thought, he said, his voice low. I've been digging into Black's past, and it's a mess. We've got one name tied to him in every known crime in this city, but it's all wrapped up in layers of deception. Whoever's behind him, they know how to cover their tracks. Emily stared at him, trying to make sense of it all. What's the next step, she asked, her voice determined. We've got to move fast. He's expecting us. Mark hesitated, as though weighing his options. We need to get to the source. We've been chasing the wrong leads. Emily, if Black is really the man behind this, we've got to find the ones who are pulling his strings. We need to infiltrate his operations, but to do that, we're going to have to make a move first. Emily nodded. She knew what that meant. It was time to face him, to confront the shadows. The rendezvous point was a dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that looked abandoned but felt like a fortress. The mansion was surrounded by high walls, with only a single, narrow entrance leading to the front gates. They parked a few blocks away, slipping through the shadows as they approached. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the weight of the night seemed to press in on them from all sides. Mark looked at Emily, his face set in grim determination. We're not just up against Black, we're up against everything he represents. Be ready for anything. Emily nodded, her hand tight on her gun. She could feel her heart racing, the familiar tension in her muscles, the heightened sense of awareness that came with a confrontation like this. They crept toward the mansion, moving as quietly as possible, but there was something in the air tonight, something that made Emily feel like they were already too late. They had been walking into traps before, but this felt different. It felt like the end of the road. As they reached the front gates, a sudden explosion of noise ripped through the silence. Move, Emily shouted, pulling Mark toward the ground as gunshots rang out from inside the mansion. They weren't alone anymore, and neither were they safe. The explosion had thrown everything into chaos. Emily's mind raced as she scrambled to get a grip on the situation. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, the rapid staccato of automatic weapons filling the night. She pulled Mark down behind the cover of a nearby car, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay calm, to keep her head in the game. But she could feel the weight of what was at stake pressing down on her. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette bathed in the orange glow of explosions and the flash of gunfire. Someone, or something, was waiting for them inside. Stay low, Emily whispered, her voice sharp. Mark nodded, gripping his gun tightly in his hand as they moved toward the mansion, staying low to the ground. Every step felt like a gamble, but there was no turning back now. They had to move forward. The front gates were open, and they could see the shadows of armed men moving inside. Emily motioned for Mark to take the left side, and she moved right. The air felt oppressive, thick with the tension of the imminent confrontation. Every inch of her body was on high alert as she approached the front door, her gun raised and ready. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, her breathing shallow as she strained to hear any movement inside. She was about to push open the door when she heard a voice that cut through the chaos with the coldness of steel. "You think you can just walk in here, Detective?" Emily froze. She recognized that voice. It was Victor Black. The man who had been nothing more than a shadow until now was standing just beyond the door, waiting for them. "You've made a mistake, Carter," Black continued, his voice calm, almost taunting. "You think this is about you, about justice, but it's bigger than that. You're just a small piece in a much larger game." Emily's heart sank. She wasn't ready for this. She had been chasing the wrong lead. She had been hunting the wrong monster. Before she could react, Black stepped into view, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto hers. He was everything she had imagined: tall, imposing, and every bit as dangerous as the rumors had said. "You think you can take me down?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Do you know who I am? Detective, I own this city. I own every corner of it. And you're just a blip on the radar. You're nothing." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, her hand gripping the gun even tighter. She wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the surge of fear in her chest. "I'm not just a blip. And you're not untouchable. Not anymore." Black smirked, clearly amused by her words. "You think you're going to save the day? You think you can defeat me? I've been untouchable for years. You're just one more pawn in my game." But something in his eyes flickered a brief moment of doubt that Emily didn't miss. She was getting to him. She could feel it. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the doorway, her gun aimed directly at him. "It's over," she said. "You're finished." Before she could pull the trigger, a sharp noise cut through the air, the sound of a gunshot, and then another. Emily's world spun as she was thrown backward, the force of the bullet sending her crashing to the ground. Pain shot through her body. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring as she struggled to stay conscious. Her hand instinctively reached for her gun, but everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The world around her seemed to fade, and for a moment, all she could hear was the ringing in her ears. And then, as if from nowhere, she heard a shout, a familiar voice. "Emily." It was Mark. He was still alive. Through the haze of pain and confusion, she managed to turn her head just in time to see Mark charging toward her, gun in hand, his face a mask of determination. He fired a shot, striking one of Black's men, the man collapsing to the ground with a grunt. "Get up!" Emily Mark shouted, pulling her to her feet. "We're not done yet." Emily blinked, trying to clear her vision as the adrenaline surged through her. She couldn't afford to be weak now. They had come too far. She had come too far. Together, they fought their way through the mansion, moving swiftly and strategically. The remaining gunmen scattered, but they were no match for Emily and Mark. The training, the years of experience, it all came flooding back in an instant. And then, they were at the heart of the mansion, the throne room, so to speak. Black was there, waiting, a twisted smile on his face as he watched them approach. "You really think you can defeat me?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "You're too late." But Emily wasn't listening to him anymore. She was done with the mind games. She was done with the manipulations. This was it. With a sudden, fluid motion, she raised her gun, her hand steady despite the chaos that raged in her chest. She aimed for Black's chest, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You've lost," she said, her voice hard and unwavering. "You're not untouchable anymore." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Black's eyes widened, the smirk slowly fading from his face. He reached for his own weapon, but it was too late. Emily fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. Black's body jerked back, a gasp of shock escaping his lips as he crumpled to the ground. Emily stood there, breathless, her chest heaving with the weight of what she had just done. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins. But now, there was only the overwhelming silence. It was over. The aftermath was a blur of sirens and flashing lights as the precinct arrived, the scene swarming with officers and investigators. Black's body was taken away, And the mansion, once a symbol of his power, was now nothing more than a crime scene. Emily stood off to the side, her eyes locked on the body bag as it was wheeled past her. The weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. She had done it. She had taken down the most powerful criminal in the city. But it hadn't come without a price. Mark approached her, his face tired but filled with respect. He clapped her on the back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You did it, Carter," he said, his voice gruff. "We did it." She nodded, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. She had won. Yes, but the cost had been high. The battle had taken more from her than she was willing to admit. "I couldn't have done it without you," Emily said quietly, her gaze distant. Mark chuckled. "We make a good team." But as the officers began to clean up the scene, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Victor Black might be dead, but his legacy, the darkness he had left behind, would take far longer to erase. The days after the fall of Victor Black felt like a haze, a blur of emotions and aftermath that Emily had no idea how to navigate. The victory was hard-earned, but it came at a steep price. The city, the precinct, and even she herself were all left to pick up the pieces of what had been shattered. And somehow, despite the sense of triumph, she couldn't escape the haunting weight of what had transpired. Victor Black was dead. The city was safe for now, but his influence, his network, still lingered in the dark corners of the underworld. Emily knew that just because one monster had fallen didn't mean the rest would stop crawling out of the shadows. She sat in her office at the precinct, her fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the desk. The phone sat silent in front of her. The files stacked neatly to the side. The reports that followed her arrest of Black now filling the pages with details she had barely skimmed. The usual hum of activity in the precinct had taken on a new tone, quiet, subdued, as if the weight of the victory was too much for anyone to truly celebrate. Mark had been right there with her every step of the way. He had stood by her when things got tough, when the leads grew colder and the danger more real. He'd been her partner, her friend, and her ally. And now, as he sat across from her in the small office, she couldn't help but wonder if anything would ever be the same. "You okay?" Mark asked, his voice gentle, as though testing the waters. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced out the window, watching as the last remnants of sunlight faded from the sky. The city stretched out before her, the same city that had nearly consumed her, the same city that still had secrets buried deep beneath its surface. She could feel the weight of it all. She could feel the burn of fatigue, both physical and mental, wrapping around her like a shroud. "I'm not sure," she finally admitted, her voice low, almost lost in the emptiness of the room. "I thought I would feel different after all of this." Mark nodded, understanding the unspoken words. He knew that feeling of empty victory all too well. Sometimes, the hardest part is realizing that even after everything is over, it's never really over. There's always more. Emily let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly as she sank back in her chair. "I know. I thought killing Black would be the end of it. But now I'm not so sure. Who else is out there? Who else is pulling the strings?" "That's the thing about this line of work," Mark said, his tone more serious now. "There's always another monster waiting in the shadows, another threat you can't see coming." The truth of his words hit Emily harder than she expected. She had spent her entire career chasing criminals, fighting for justice, and she had thought that bringing down Black would be the moment she could finally breathe easy. But there was no closure, no clean ending. The city was full of threats, and no matter how many she took down, there would always be more to fight. "I don't think I can keep doing this forever," Emily murmured, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, this. The constant chase. The fear. The way it eats at you. I don't know if I have it in me anymore." Mark's expression softened, and for a moment, The hardened detective disappeared, replaced by the friend who had been there through thick and thin. You're not the only one who feels that way. Hell, I've been there too. But Emily, you're one of the best. You've got something they don't, something I've never seen in anyone else. You've got the heart of a fighter. Emily shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You always know what to say, don't you? I'm just telling you the truth, Mark replied. You've been through hell and back, but that's why you can't stop now, not when you've come this far. The words were meant to comfort, but they didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. Instead, they only added to the weight that seemed to press down on her chest. She had been fighting for so long that she wasn't sure who she was without the battle. The idea of walking away, of finding peace, felt impossible. She didn't even know where to begin. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next, Emily confessed, the vulnerability in her voice stark. I thought I would feel relieved when it was over, but all I feel is empty. Mark didn't answer right away. He simply sat there, watching her with a look of quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was going through. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Take it one day at a time. You've earned the right to figure it out. Emily nodded slowly, grateful for his unwavering support, even if she wasn't sure she could fully accept it. The path ahead seemed uncertain, and the future felt like an endless sea of possibilities she wasn't ready to navigate. Later that night, after the precinct had quieted down and the city outside had settled into its usual rhythm, Emily found herself back at her apartment. The silence was almost deafening, the weight of her thoughts pressing in on her once again. She had been so caught up in the chase, so focused on the fight, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live outside of it. She sat on the couch, staring at the empty space in front of her. The apartment, once a refuge from the world, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with the reality of everything she had lost. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to shake off the sense of exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. Her eyes wandered to the window, where the city lights twinkled in the distance, far too bright for the darkness that had crept into her heart. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood up, her muscles stiff and weary, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see a familiar face standing there. Detective Jacobs. Mark. I thought you might need this, he said, holding out a bottle of wine and a small bag of takeout food. Emily blinked, not sure if she should be grateful or confused. Mark, it's late. I know, he said, stepping past her without waiting for an invitation. But you've been through a hell of a lot, and you need to stop for a minute. Take a breath. You deserve it. Emily closed the door behind him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe it wasn't the grand revelation she had been hoping for, but it was a small moment of peace, a reminder that she didn't have to do everything alone. Maybe the road ahead was uncertain, but for tonight, at least, she wasn't fighting alone. Mark unpacked the food and poured 2 glasses of wine, setting the bottle aside. As they sat down together on the couch, the silence between them was comfortable, familiar. It wasn't about words. It was about the quiet understanding that, despite everything, there was still hope. A year later, Emily stood at the edge of the city, overlooking the skyline. The storm had passed. The chaos had subsided. She had made peace with her past, with the battles she had fought and the ones still to come. But more importantly, she had made peace with herself. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. It felt like the beginning of something new. She had found a new purpose, not just in the job, but in life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly living. A year had passed since the fall of Victor Black, and though the memory of the battle remained fresh in Emily's mind, the world around her had changed. The city was quieter now, less dangerous, less frantic. The shadows that once seemed to stretch across every corner of the city had been reduced to fleeting memories, and Emily could finally breathe without the weight of constant fear pressing down on her. Her life had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her career, once a driving force that consumed her every waking moment, had begun to take a backseat to something more personal, something more fulfilling. She had found a new sense of purpose, a peace she hadn't thought possible. Sitting at her favorite cafe on the corner of the street, Emily sipped her coffee, watching the world go by. The bustling city outside seemed like a distant hum, a low noise that she could ignore now, rather than the overwhelming tide that had once threatened to swallow her whole. She no longer needed to be at the center of it all. She had learned to find calm in the stillness, to appreciate the quiet moments. It wasn't that she had stopped being a detective, far from it. She still took cases, but now they were the ones that felt right, the ones that truly mattered to her. No longer did she feel the crushing weight of every case she took. She had learned to trust her instincts more, to listen to her heart, and to balance the pursuit of justice with the need for her own well-being. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, the name that appeared bringing a smile to her face. Mark Jacobs. She had heard from him occasionally over the past year, but their relationship had evolved into something deeper. Their partnership had been forged in the fire of shared battles. But now, it was something different. It was a friendship, a bond that had survived the chaos and emerged stronger than ever. Emily swiped the screen, answering with a grin. "Hey, Mark, what's up?" "Not much." Mark's voice came through the phone, light and easy. "I've got a lead for you. Something small, but I thought you might be interested." "You in?" Emily paused, the question hanging in the air. For a moment, she considered the offer. She could feel the old pull, the rush of the chase, the call of the unknown. She could always go back to the job, to the fight. But would it be worth it? Would it cost her everything she had worked so hard to build? "I don't know, Mark," Emily replied, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's time for a new chapter." Mark chuckled on the other end. "I get it. But hey, this case, it's got your name written all over it. You've got a knack for finding the truth when no one else can. You're the best. Emily." She smiled at the compliment. "You always know how to make me feel good about myself." "It's not flattery if it's true," Mark said. "But seriously, you've got a gift. Don't waste it." Emily took a deep breath. She knew Mark was right. The city was still full of secrets, and she had spent so long digging them up that it was hard to walk away entirely. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't about running after every lead, every criminal who needed to be caught. It was about making the right choice, for herself and for the people she cared about. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it. One last case." As she sat across from Mark in the small, dimly lit office, where they had often debriefed their cases, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of what this moment meant. This wasn't the beginning of another battle. It was the end of one chapter and the start of another. The decision she made now wouldn't define her forever. She had already proven that she was capable of more than anyone could ever expect. She looked at Mark, his familiar face as reassuring as it had always been. There were still traces of the exhaustion that had followed them through the months of relentless cases, but there was something else in his eyes now: hope. A hope that had long been buried beneath the weight of their work. A hope that, for the first time in a long time, wasn't tied to an outcome or a victory, but simply to the journey. "This is it, huh?" Emily said, raising her eyebrows with a slight smirk. "One last ride." Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the table. "We don't know that yet. We'll see how it goes." "Yeah, we'll see," Emily replied, her tone light but serious. "But no matter what happens, we've done good work. We've made a difference. That's what matters." Mark nodded in agreement. "You're right. And no matter where we go from here, That's not something anyone can take away from us. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. The decision she had made wasn't just about the work, it was about the life she was building. A life that was no longer dominated by the darkness of crime, but by the light of the choices she was finally free to make. She had found herself again, and that was worth more than any victory she had ever claimed. That night, as Emily stood on the balcony of her apartment, the city sprawled before her, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It had been a year since Black's death, a year since she had allowed herself to imagine a life outside of the battle. And now, standing here, she realized that everything had come full circle. The city had changed, and so had she. The past had shaped her, had built her into the person she was. The battles, the struggles, the victories, they had all taught her something invaluable. But the future was a blank canvas, and it was hers to paint. Ready for the next chapter, Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to find him standing behind her, a knowing look in his eyes. "I think so," Emily said, her smile soft but confident. "I think I'm ready." And as she looked out over the city, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it head on. She had already fought the hardest battles of her life. Now, it was time to embrace the peace that was waiting for her, to live a life that was more than just the pursuit of justice. She had found a balance. She had found herself. And for the first time in years, Emily felt like she could finally breathe easy. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow across the skyline as Emily stood in front of the precinct, her coat pulled tightly around her. The city had a chill in the air, one that spoke of new beginnings, yet it also carried the weight of everything that had come before. Her breath fogged in the cold, mingling with the morning mist that hung over the streets. She had no idea what the day would bring, but she knew it would be different from everything before. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was, Mark. She smiled to herself before answering. "Morning," she said, her voice warm but tinged with the fatigue of the past few days. "Morning. Emily, I'm heading to the office now. We've got a case. One last one. You ready?" Mark's voice came through clear, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in his words. Emily's grip tightened on the phone, her fingers curling around the device. She had been ready to walk away from it all, but life always had a way of pulling her back in. The decision she had made a year ago had felt like a relief at the time. But now, after everything she had experienced, she wasn't sure she could turn her back on the world she had spent so many years fighting for. "One last case," Emily repeated softly, the weight of the words settling in. She glanced at the city before her, taking in the towering buildings and the endless stream of traffic. It was the city that had both shaped her and scarred her. The city that had given her purpose but had also demanded everything from her. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "See you soon." She took a deep breath, adjusting her jacket as she made her way to the car. The decision was made. She would take on this last case if only to bring closure to the chapter that had shaped her for so long. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about finding peace within herself. It was about knowing when to stop, when to let go. When Emily arrived at the precinct, Mark was already waiting for her. His usual easygoing demeanor was absent today, replaced with a more focused, somber expression. "You good?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow as she stepped into the small office. Mark nodded, his hands gripping the file in front of him. "We've got a missing persons case. A high-profile one, the mayor's daughter. We've got nothing but a few leads, but it's serious. No one's saying it. But I can tell this could be bigger than we think." Emily studied Mark's face, his concern evident. This wasn't just another case. There was something behind this one that neither of them could ignore. "So, what do we know?" Emily asked, her voice firm. Mark opened the file and slid it across the desk to her. "A few days ago, the mayor's daughter, Sarah Hughes, went missing. The family's keeping things under wraps, but it's getting harder to conceal. No one's seen her, and there's no sign of where she's gone. Emily flipped through the file, scanning the details. There's no ransom note. Mark shook his head. Nothing. Just gone. There's been talk, but we're not sure if it's just the media trying to stir things up. All I know is that the mayor's desperate. He wants us on this. Emily paused, taking in the gravity of the situation. The mayor's family was powerful, and this was a case that had the potential to affect the city in ways they couldn't even predict. If this was a kidnapping, it could escalate quickly. If it was something worse, well, she didn't want to think about that. Let's get started, Emily said, her voice quiet but resolute. I'll take the lead on this one. The investigation started slowly, as most cases did, with a trail of small clues and dead ends. They interviewed Sarah's friends, family, and anyone who might have had contact with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. But everything led to more questions than answers. No one had seen or heard from Sarah in days, and the few people who had were too vague or frightened to be of any real help. Emily spent hours poring over the evidence, her mind running through possible scenarios: the lack of a ransom note, the absence of any demands. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit the usual patterns of kidnappings or abductions. The more she thought about it, the more she realized there was something off about this case. As they dug deeper, the team uncovered a disturbing lead, a connection between Sarah Hughes and a notorious underground figure, someone who had crossed paths with Emily before. His name was Thomas Calloway, a former tech mogul turned criminal mastermind. He had been on Emily's radar years ago when she was still working full-time on the streets. But he had always managed to slip through her fingers. Mark leaned in, his voice tense. Calloway. I thought we were done with him. The last we heard, he was out of the picture. Why would he be involved with Sarah? Emily frowned. That's the question, isn't it? But if Calloway's involved, we need to move quickly. He's dangerous. And if he has anything to do with Sarah's disappearance, this could escalate fast. Should we go after him? Mark asked, clearly conflicted. They both knew how dangerous Calloway was, and the idea of going after him was not something to be taken lightly. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. We'll keep an eye on him for now, but we need more information before we make any moves. We can't afford to be reckless. The hours passed, and Emily found herself sifting through the last of the leads. She knew they were too close, but there was still so much that didn't add up. As the night wore on, she felt a familiar unease settle in her gut. There was something about this case, something about Sarah's disappearance, that she couldn't shake. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Emily and Mark had been going over the last few reports when a phone call came through. The voice on the other end was shaky, urgent. Detective Carter, the voice said. I've got information. I know where she is. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. Who is this? She demanded. I'm just a friend of Sarah's, the voice said. I didn't know what to do, but I can't keep quiet anymore. I know where they're holding her. I've seen the place, but I'm afraid. Where? Emily interrupted, her pulse racing. Follow the tracks, the voice whispered. Near the old factory on 5th and Rosewood. That's where they're keeping her. Before Emily could ask another question, the line went dead. Emily and Mark rushed to the location, the old factory standing abandoned and quiet in the dark. The train tracks ran parallel to the building, twisted and rusted, a forgotten part of the city's past. They moved quickly, making their way toward the building's rear entrance, where they found a small, barely visible door that led to a darkened hallway inside. Stay sharp, Emily whispered to Mark, her voice low but firm. The air was thick with tension, the anticipation hanging between them. They moved deeper into the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. The place felt like a ghost town, its long-forgotten machinery and broken windows giving it an eerie, decayed presence. But as they made their way through the building, the sound of voices reached their ears, faint, but unmistakable. Emily motioned for Mark to stay back as she crept toward the source of the noise. There, in the dim light, she saw Sarah, She was bound, her face bruised, but alive. And standing over her was none other than Thomas Calloway, the man who had eluded her for years. "Emily," Calloway said, his voice mocking, "I knew you'd show up eventually." The tension in the air was palpable. Emily's gun was in her hand before she even realized it, the cold metal a reminder of how far she had come. This was it, the final confrontation. "Let her go, Calloway," Emily demanded, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Calloway laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think it's that simple? You think you can walk in here and take her from me? You've always underestimated me. Detective." "You're done, Calloway," Emily said, her grip tightening on the gun. "This ends tonight." The final standoff was a blur, shots fired, threats exchanged, and in the end, it was Emily's unwavering determination that won out. Calloway was taken down, and Sarah was rescued. As the dust settled and the sirens wailed in the distance, Emily realized that this case, like all the others, had come to an end. But this time, something was different. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, and she felt finally at peace. The weeks following the takedown of Thomas Calloway and the rescue of Sarah Hughes were filled with a strange kind of silence. The world had been irrevocably changed by everything Emily had experienced, but it wasn't the kind of chaos she had once thrived in. It was the quiet of a new chapter, the peace that followed the storm. In the days after the case was closed, Emily spent most of her time at the precinct, going through the motions of paperwork and debriefs. But the energy in the air had shifted. The thrill of the chase, the adrenaline-fueled days and nights of solving case after case, seemed distant now. It had all blurred together into something she couldn't fully understand. The need to prove herself, to fight for justice, had been replaced by an unspoken desire for something more, something beyond the world of criminals and investigations. Her apartment had become more of a sanctuary than ever before. It was a place where she could shed the weight of her career, where she could simply breathe. She found herself taking longer walks in the mornings, sitting by the window to watch the city wake up and savoring the rare moments of stillness. The thrill of the chase, the pressure of the job, had been replaced with something simpler: peace. It was a feeling she hadn't known she needed until she found it. Still, Emily knew deep down that the peace she longed for wasn't something that could be easily maintained. There would always be cases, always be people who needed help. She couldn't walk away from that, not completely, but for the first time in years, she had found a balance. She wasn't running from something anymore. She was learning how to live with it. A few weeks after Calloway's takedown, Emily found herself sitting across from Mark in their usual spot at a local cafe. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the table between them. There was a different energy between them now, a calmness that hadn't been there before. "So, what now?" Emily asked, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked at Mark, but there was no anxiety in her gaze, only curiosity. Mark leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. He had always been the more relaxed of the two, but there was something about the way he answered now that showed a deeper understanding of what was at stake. "I think we've both been running for a long time," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And maybe it's time to stop and let life catch up with us." Emily raised an eyebrow, a half smile tugging at her lips. "That sounds like something out of a self-help book." Mark chuckled, a short, genuine laugh. "Maybe it is, but I think we've earned the right to slow down." She thought about it for a moment, her gaze drifting out the window toward the bustling street outside. The city was still alive, still full of movement and energy, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't in a rush. It was as though the constant drive to chase after the next case, the next lead, the next victory, had finally loosened its grip on her. "What about you?" Emily asked. "Are you ready for that? To slow down?" Mark met her eyes, his expression thoughtful. "I'm still figuring that out, but I think I'm close. And I think you're already ahead of me." Emily shook her head. "I don't think anyone is ever truly ahead. We just get where we need to be. Eventually. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, letting the weight of their conversation settle between them. It wasn't about cases or criminals. It was about the journey they had both been on, the paths they had chosen, and the decisions they had made. Emily realized, in that moment, that she wasn't afraid of the future anymore. She had faced the worst of it, and now it was time to look forward, to take what she had learned and use it to build something new. That afternoon, Emily found herself walking through the precinct once more, the familiar sights and sounds of the building providing a sense of nostalgia she hadn't expected. The detectives worked at their desks, the buzz of conversation filling the air as they reviewed their latest cases. But it wasn't the same. There was no urgency, no overwhelming pressure to dive into the chaos that used to define her every day. Instead, Emily felt a calmness settle over her. She had done the work. She had fought the good fight. And now she could choose how to move forward. When she walked into her old office, she paused for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings. The stacks of paperwork, the whiteboard covered in notes, the files filled with cases she had solved and cases that still haunted her. It all felt so distant now, like another lifetime. Mark appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral. "You thinking about going back to the grind?" Emily shook her head slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "No. I think I'm done with that for a while." Mark smiled back, stepping into the office and leaning against the doorframe. "You know, I think you've earned it. You've given everything to this job. Maybe it's time to take a step back." "I'm not quitting," Emily said quickly, though there was no real panic in her voice. I don't want it to consume me anymore. I've been running for so long that I forgot how to live when I wasn't chasing after something." Mark nodded, understanding. It's hard to remember that sometimes, especially when you're so deep in it. But it's like you said, we're just getting where we need to be. Emily smiled again, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She had spent so many years trying to be everything to everyone else, trying to solve the unsolvable, to right the wrongs. But now, she realized, it was time to take care of herself. She had done enough for others. Now, it was time to do something for her. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Emily turned to see a familiar face, Detective Jacobs, her former partner, walking into the office with a file in hand. "Emily, I know you said you were stepping back, but there's a case I need your help with." "It's a tough one. I think you'll want to hear it," Jacobs said, his voice serious. She felt the familiar pull of the job, the call to action, the desire to solve the next puzzle, but this time, there was no rush, no urgency. "I'll take a look," Emily said, her voice calm, "but only if it's something that truly needs me. I'm not diving back in unless it matters." Jacobs nodded, handing her the file. "It's a tough one. A kid missing for days. No leads, no suspects. His family's desperate. They're not asking for help. But I think we can solve this." Emily opened the file, scanning the details of the case. The name of the missing child flashed before her eyes, and something deep within her stirred. This wasn't just a case, it was a chance to make a real difference. It was a chance to use everything she had learned and give it back to the world. After a long pause, Emily closed the file and looked up at Jacobs. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady. "One last time." The investigation was intense, filled with the usual dead ends and false leads. But as they dug deeper, Emily realized that this case wasn't like the others. It wasn't just about finding the missing boy. It was about understanding the human cost of what they did, about reconnecting with the people who needed them. In the end, they found the boy, safe and sound, hiding in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The relief that washed over his family was enough to make every moment of doubt and fatigue worthwhile. As they stood in the quiet aftermath of the rescue, Emily realized something profound. The chase, the work, it would always be there. But it didn't have to define her. She had found a new balance, one that allowed her to continue doing what she loved without losing herself in the process. And for the first time, Emily knew she had made the right choice. The journey was never easy, but it had brought her here, to this moment of peace. And for that, she was grateful. The city was still the same, yet everything felt different now. The streets were as noisy as ever, the lights as bright, the chaos of daily life unchanged. But for Emily, something had shifted, deep within herself. It was like the world had finally stopped spinning so fast, and for the first time in a long time, she could catch her breath. She had done it. She had won the battles that mattered. And now, she was free. She walked through the precinct that morning with a sense of finality, feeling the weight of the past few years slip off her shoulders. The building was familiar, a place where she had spent countless hours, where she had built her career and fought battles that left their mark. But today, it felt like nothing more than a chapter in a long story. She had made her peace with it. And now it was time to close that book. Mark was sitting at his desk when she entered, a stack of papers in front of him. His face softened when he saw her. The usual grin he wore now tempered with a more serious expression. He looked like he had something to say, but he didn't speak at first, choosing instead to study her for a moment. "You look different," he said finally, his voice laced with both curiosity and respect. Emily met his gaze, taking a moment before responding. "I feel different. It's strange. You know, the first time in years. I'm not chasing something. I'm just here." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. It's been a hell of a ride, hasn't it?" She leaned against the desk, a small smile on her lips. "I've been running for so long, and now, I think it's time to stop." "Stop?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated before speaking, the weight of her words sinking in. "I mean, I'm done with the job. I'm stepping away." The words felt like a relief, and yet, they also brought a certain heaviness. She had spent her entire life in pursuit of justice, of finding the truth no matter the cost. But now, the cost seemed too great. She had given so much, and in the end, it had all led her to this moment of peace. Mark didn't seem shocked. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. "You've earned it. Emily, you've given everything to this job. But there's something I've been thinking about." Emily looked at him, intrigued. "What's that?" Mark's eyes met hers, his expression a mix of seriousness and something softer. "I know you, and I know what this job has cost you. But there's one thing you've never done. You've never let yourself rest. You've never taken the time to just live. Maybe it's time for that." Emily paused, the truth of his words settling deep inside her. She had been so focused on the next case, the next lead, the next victory, that she had never really allowed herself to just stop and enjoy life. She had missed birthdays, anniversaries, the simple pleasures of being alive, all for the sake of justice. But now, after everything, she realized that there was more to life than the work she had dedicated herself to. "I don't know where to start," Emily confessed quietly. "I've spent so long in the fight that I'm not sure who I am without it." Mark smiled, a rare, understanding smile. "You'll figure it out. You always do. But you're not alone in this. You've got people who care about you, and you've got me." Her throat tightened at his words. "Thanks, Mark. I don't know what I would have done without you." They shared a moment of silence, a moment of understanding between two people who had been through hell and back together. Emily realized that despite the darkness and the pain, she had found something real, something lasting. She had built a friendship with Mark that went beyond the cases they had worked on, a bond that would remain even after she walked away from the job. The door to the office creaked open, and Emily turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway, holding a coffee cup in his hand. His expression was more relaxed than usual, though there was a look of concern in his eyes. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice light. You sure you're really leaving? She smiled at him, her heart warmed by the familiarity of his presence. Yeah, I think it's time. Jacobs looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Well, if you're leaving, then I guess you've earned it. You've always been the one to take the hardest cases, the toughest situations, and you've always come out on top. Emily's smile widened. I couldn't have done it without you. Jacobs, you've been a hell of a partner. The three of them stood there, in the heart of the precinct, and for the first time, Emily felt no pressure to keep going. No need to chase after the next case, the next victory. She had done enough. Now, it was time to embrace a different kind of life, one that was not defined by the badge or the job. She had given her all to the city, to the people who needed her. But now, it was time to live for herself. The decision wasn't easy, but once made, it came with an unexpected sense of peace. Emily spent the following weeks saying her goodbyes, finishing the last few tasks that remained, and preparing herself for a life beyond the precinct. She knew it would be hard to walk away from the job that had been her entire identity for so long, but she also knew that she was ready. One day, as she walked out of the precinct for the last time, she paused at the door, taking a long look at the building that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. She had given so much to this place, but now it was time to let it go. It was time to stop running. Mark stood beside her, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression calm but thoughtful. Ready? Emily nodded, her gaze still fixed on the building. Yeah, I think I am. Together, they walked away from the precinct, from the city that had defined their lives. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right one. They had both been through the worst of it, and now, they were free to create something new. The city stretched out before them, alive with possibilities. Emily didn't know exactly where she was going, but for the first time, she didn't need to. She had done her part. She had fought her battles. And now, it was time to find peace. As they walked, side by side, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She was no longer a detective chasing justice. She was simply Emily, and that was enough.